Hi, everyone. Welcome to another Kepler conversation. And today I am here with Dr. Charley Dewberry of Gutenberg College. Welcome, Charley.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Joffre. Glad to be here.
So today I want to talk about science in classical Christian education, but I think we should approach it through something that Gutenberg at large sort of uses as a paradigm for approaching education, and that is the idea of micro-exegesis. Could you explain a little bit about what is meant in this academic setting for micro-exegesis?
Okay. Well, in a normal great books curriculum, you're reading the major works of Western civilization. And so that's reading for breadth. But what we also want to do is we really emphasize reading for depth. And one of the major reasons for that is a major focus of putting the Gutenberg curriculum together was it's centered around reading the Bible and understanding what the Bible is actually saying. So it's slowing down and being very careful about word usage, how sentences are fitting into paragraphs, that sort of thing. So in microexegesis, we pick difficult works. So as freshmen, they start out with something from Aristotle, something unfamiliar to them. And they just jump in and we start taking it line by line. And just start working on how the words are related in the sentences, how the sentences are related to paragraphs, and just go very slow and develop the skill of paying very close attention to what I call the depth of reading.
Right.
So so that's a central piece of what we're attempting to do at Gutenberg.
Yeah, you know, there's a classical Christian college who I shall not name now, but you know, when I attended there, they've changed this since then, but when I attended, in the first week we were taught to speed read, and I don't remember if it was 1 week or two, but we read The City of God, and lightning fast. And in a way, it was cool to have learned to read that way. But it also, the satisfaction I got from it was, you know, being able to kick butt through the speed of it.
Yeah.
I didn't really get the satisfaction of, wow, like I got to sit in the city of God and stew and you know, really talk it through. And, you know, and since then, that school's moved away from that approach, which I really appreciate, because you know, there's so much that you want to incorporate in your education, but you have to balance that with, you know, if there's not intimate knowledge, is it real knowledge? So you mentioned,
yeah, well,
sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, well, yeah, and from our perspective, the Bible is a very difficult book to read, and we all come at it with the lenses and with all our understanding that we have of the Bible. So we're naturally going to just read it given our lenses.
Right.
But the real question is, what is the author trying to say here? And you really have to slow down and pay close attention.
Well, these days, the question, what is the author trying to say, is actually pretty revolutionary.
Yeah, that's very
We're
true.
actually going to ask the person who wrote this what he meant. Yeah. Well, you know, here's sort of a side question for you. And you've already mentioned Aristotle. And so, you know, I suspect I know at least some of what you'll answer here. But you've focused in, you've zoomed in on the Bible more than once already in this short conversation. What makes Gutenberg College not a Bible college?
Well, Gutenberg College came out of an experience with what was the Mackenzie Study Center earlier. It was a L'Abri type study center. And if people aren't familiar with that, it was a study center put together with a group of Christians that was adjacent to a secular university. And the idea was to help Christians deal with their secular education while they're going through it. Well, a part of that was a program that was basically a master's level program in biblical exegesis. So it was teaching you how to translate, how to interpret the Bible. But what I would say is what made it not a Bible college per se is it didn't teach any doctrine, or it didn't teach any theology. You had to derive it yourself. And so the whole program was built around the skills of careful interpretation. And that's kind of what I would say is the foundational difference.
Yeah.
Is, we want to know what the author means, not how this denomination interprets something.
Right. And and you can bring that method of reading into anything written.
Right.
So,
and that's part of the whole program, the interconnected part of all of the great books are difficult. So we're all working on the same skill. And and the Bible is one of those great books. So it's the same skills.
We as Christians ought to, so we derive all meaning from God's revelation to us. The Bible is God's revelation to us. And so that means that any paradigm of interpretation we might bring, our own lenses, the Bible is unassailable. We're not going to damage God's revelation. Right. So let's go ahead and dive in. Let's explore, as opposed to, I think often Christians treat God's word as if it was something that we could harm, that we could damage. Obviously, we can bring sin into it, but we ought to have the confidence in our own Lord to go ahead and take the Bible on, so that it can cut us up into pieces and offer us up as sacrifices.
Yep.
Sorry, I just went off on a rant there. I apologize.
Yeah, no problem. No, absolutely. That's absolutely right. Still, I've been doing this like 40 years, and my lens is still changing.
Yes.
I'm still learning.
Are you telling me you're being sanctified? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, let's actually go ahead and take what for some may be a bit of a wild leap.
Okay.
You are a scientist, a science teacher. So why are you approaching education in this way?
Well, it's a very interesting story. If you back up to when I was in graduate school, this would be the last place you would ever expect to find me. Because ever since I was in like first grade, I knew what I wanted to be. And that was a research scientist in aquatic ecology, fisheries biologist or a stream ecologist. And everything went fine until I finished my master's, and I was driving out to Oregon to do a PhD. And I picked up a few books to read on the way out. And for the first time in my life, I threw a couple of philosophy books in the stack. So on my way out to Oregon from Michigan, I tried to read them. The first thing I realized is I couldn't read them. I'm a science geek. I can't read anything like philosophy, but I could actually read them well enough to know they had destroyed everything I'd ever been taught about science and how to do it. We all know the story. Science is a method, gives you greater objectivity and certainty and all that. The books were telling me every line of that argument is actually fallacious and not defensible. And I was like, well, what am I going to do with this? Because they were pretty convincing.
Yeah.
So through my PhD, I was struggling with what is science and how to do it. At the same time, I'm trying to do a PhD. Anyway, short part of this is I got to defending my dissertation, and I had a chapter in philosophy of science in it. And my advisor, who I'd known since high school, said to me, you can't have that in there. You have to decide if you want to do philosophy or science. And if you actually believe that philosophy of science, then we can't legitimately give you a PhD.
Wow.
And so I didn't defend it. I didn't take that chapter out. So the question was, well, now what am I going to do? So I started working in the field. I'd always been a field biologist, so I just went and worked in the field for a while. And then somebody told me I should go talk to this guy, a tutor at the Mackenzie Study Center. So I went to talk with him, and he had degrees in theology and physics from Stanford. And anyway, I sat down and said, well, here's where I came about what science is, and this is what I think science is and how to do it. And he said, well, I think you're exactly right. the only thing I have to tell you is only a theist could believe that. And at that point, that was the furthest thing from my mind. And anyway, so out of that, I actually went to the School of Exegesis that I mentioned before. And I was one of the unprepared students to do it. So I really struggled through it. But anyway, so I came to have a very different view of what science education is in the context of this curriculum. We want to make a distinction in our culture between here's science and here's the arts. There's a dichotomy. And my argument is science is high art. There is no dichotomy. So in my mind, they're one and the same.
Yeah. I mean, we could get into we'll go into all sorts of rabbit trails, like what the word tech, means,
right.
And
exactly, yeah,
what art is.
Right.
I mean, I think that's wonderful. So it's a question for you that sort of springs to mind as I look at science and scientists today. I mean, a few decades ago, certainly we were, in the throes of modernity, kind of dealing with some of the same crises that you were, and postmodern thought was really beginning to take a foothold. And somehow we've transitioned today to, in my opinion, and I'd love to have you interact with this, most of the West just sort of accepts a sort of priesthood of science, right? So whatever science is, it's the facts, and the facts are what everyone has to kowtow to. This is how reality is defined. And of course, it's strictly materialistic. I wonder how you interact with that notion. Do you think such a priesthood exists?
Well, does it exist for the culture? Sure,
right.
It does. And the scientists absolutely believe it's true.
Yes.
But actually, to get at your question of exactly how we incorporate it in, we spend a year looking at the Copernican revolution at Gutenberg. And it's a long time in a liberal arts program to have a specific class where you're just doing the Copernicans. And why are we doing the Copernicans? Well, everybody would agree that the Copernicans founded modern science. But the question is, well, what was their take on what science is and how do you do it? So that was the piece that led to my revolution in thinking about science, because the first thing is, is not a method. And two, none of these guys were testing hypotheses to start with. In fact, as the students look at the details of the Copernican revolution, if you take modern scientists with their view of science and put them back in that time, they would all side with the Catholic Church against the Copernicans in every case.
Yeah,
and the reason is,
sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, and the reason is the church's position was, well, the Copernicans are claiming their theory is true, but there's no empirical difference between their theory and Ptolemy's theory. So therefore, there's no empirical evidence that their theory is true. So they can't claim their theory is true. Not until they have empirical evidence that it's true.
Right.
Well, none of the Copernicans thought that. Copernicus thought his theory was true, and he'd given a justification for that.
Right. And for viewers, what Charley's talking about, you can easily find online, like say, letters from the Inquisition, justifying including Galileo's work in, the Index of Prohibited Books. Off of there's insufficient proof. You can't teach it until you found. So it actually is the church that, you're right, we would have more sympathy with if we actually knew the story. So would you say then that the Copernicans were philosophizing? How would you describe the work they were doing?
Well, yeah, in part, in order for Copernicus to have critiqued Ptolemy, he had to ask the question, well, what is science and how do you do it? And that's a philosophical question. That was one of the bombshells for me, is I realized the question, what is science and how you do it? That's not a scientific question. Don't ask scientists that, because they don't know anything about that. So that was the bomb for me, was, wait a minute, those questions are philosophical, they're not science questions. And that was actually the piece that shook my world.
Yeah.
Was,
when I hear your story, when you're younger and you start to have these philosophical questions, it actually shapes the work that you do and stops you from doing some work. I think most people would have simply reacted by putting their heads down and just continuing on. But there's no sphere of effort in life. Whether you're a visual artist or a cook, like whatever it is, if you don't know why you're doing the thing and what the cosmic meaning of it is, why are you doing it? Like I've never really been able to understand that. But I suppose that is why so many in our society and our society as a whole, is in existential crisis, because we've been working and working and working without an answer to that question.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. It's just, I couldn't see a reason for doing this anymore if I didn't know what I was doing. So, yeah. So anyway, that's why I ended up getting my PhD in philosophy of science. I went back to the U of O, and let me tell you, that was a struggle because I didn't have any background in humanities. I avoided them my entire life.
Right. I would love to hear what the U of O's justification for allowing you in that program was.
Well, it's really funny because the graduate advisor was a Jewish guy, very bright. His father taught at mathematics at Jerusalem Institute. And I came in and said I wanted to do this. And he said, well, you're nuts, because you got a good job. You're a scientist. You got a master's and 10 years experience in the field. You don't want to do this. And it's going to be hard because philosophy is a lot different than science. This is going to be a struggle if you do it. And I said, well, I really want to do it. And he said, well, okay, we'll try it for a quarter and see how this goes. And anyway, at the end of quarter, I came back in and he said, well, you're just really an enigma to me, because you read carefully. Where'd you learn to do that? That I didn't tell him that it was the exegesis program, that 3 years of exegesis.
Those Christians over there.
Yeah, I didn't tell him that, but I just said, well, I spent some time working on reading carefully. So anyway, he just said, well, I think you're crazy, but
but you did it.
Yeah.
Well, I'd love to close with you're here as a representative of Gutenberg. I'd love to hear from you why the science-minded among us might head to your college.
Okay. Well, first, if you're going to be a scientist, somewhere in your science program, you should ask the question, what is science? How do you do it? And what are its limits? What are its strengths and what are its limits? You won't find that in a science program, many science programs. I'll just put it that way. Secondly, we're also human beings. It seems to me education is for a number of things. First, sure, job training is important. We all need to be able to put food and shelter, put food on the table and have shelter and those sorts of things. But we're also citizens in a nation. But the other part for me that's central is, especially for Christians, we're all Christians. We ought to really be honing our skills of interpreting the Bible. That's absolutely, it seems to me, central to being a Christian. And all of those things go together. It's a human endeavor. It's not just getting trained for a job. And so it seems to me that if you're going to be a scientist, it makes sense to get a good, well-rounded undergrad degree, because if you're a scientist, you're obviously going on to more specialized training. The other part of it is just a comment that PhD used to mean doctorate of philosophy.
Right. Yeah. And now, and natural philosophy was what scientists did.
Right.
Well, I think that there's definitely a tendency among Christian families, among homeschooling families, to look at undergrad work as prereqs, right? Mm-hmm. And so there I think there's often an overreaction. If my child intends to, or if I intend to study such and such in grad school, if I want to go to med school, whatever it is, and I can't waste time on Latin class and philosophy. Right. I need to get as and it actually is. That's not the case. Not even in the state systems. That's not the case.
Right. Well, yeah. Take your best medical schools. Go look. Almost all of them have blocks set up for liberal arts students. So you aren't competing against the pre-meds in those blocks. You're only competing against other liberal arts. Uh-huh. Now, as of yet, we haven't had a student go to medical school directly from here at the leading medical schools in the country, but the opportunity's there. Yeah. And they wouldn't have to compete against pre-meds.
Right.
And basically what those schools have learned is the liberal arts students do just as well as the pre-med students, but they recognize that they bring a whole different perspective to medicine. And they recognize the importance of that.
Yes, absolutely. Well, you also mentioned that, as we begin to close, that if you study science as it's popularly conceived, it doesn't really provide, that meaning and that significance. But sort of beyond that, I would add that there's a perniciousness to the fact that it's not just that there's a lack of that in science education, because actually science education, non-Christian science education, the desire is usually to pretend that it is there, right? To tell you right. that this is everything,
right?
And that you need to find meaning in this. So it really is important to prepare with a whole education, with a classical education, the sort of thing you guys offer, before you get into the sciences in earnest.
Right. Yes. Yeah. So, for example, those interested in biology and ecology, we're going to look at Aristotle on classification. We're going to look at Darwin on classification. We're going to look at Crick and Watson on classification. We'll look at Michael Polanyi on classification. And they're going to realize that these are difficult issues, and they're not just scientific. Most of them are largely philosophical issues, and scientists have no background in it. And it's just interesting that in our culture, whenever these topics come up, who is it that sits around the table debating it? It's always scientists, but why do they have this main seats at the table? Why do they have the only seats at the table? So, for example, the interaction between intelligent design and evolution. It struck me that I had said I'd never write anything about it because it's a philosophical issue primarily. It's not a scientific issue. But after the ruling by the judge and just the way both sides presented their argument, I had to write my answer to it. So I did write a book on that. But as I say, our students investigate that for themselves. I mean, they read Darwin, they know what Darwin's argument is, and they have to decide what they're going to do with that.
Right. Excellent. Well, I've really enjoyed this visit. I appreciate you making a little time to talk to us. I'm going to put links to your books down below under this video. And thanks again for your time.
You bet. Thank you, Joffre.